Hello. So thank you everybody for coming along this afternoon for the launch of the Facebook Receipts, which is a new initiative from the Real Facebook Oversight Board. And in this event, we are going to play the brand new parlor game, Who's on Facebook's Payroll, in the 118th Congress. I'm Carol Cadwallader. I'm a journalist with The Guardian and Observer, and I'm part of this group which brought together the Real Facebook Oversight Board in 2020. So I'm just going to keep this really brief. We have 5 brilliant speakers today, and we'll be following that by questions from the press. And what we're going to be talking about is power, influence, and money, and particularly the money that is flowing through Congress. And we're going to be asking the questions about what is the relationship between that and the fact that in the 5 years since the Cambridge Analytica scandal and all these other tech scandals, we've had precisely 0 legislation. So we are going to be Zaman Qureshi, who is here, who is the wonderkind who is behind the Facebook Receipts, will be presenting a sort of brief insight into some of the headlines of that he's discovered through this sort of amazing data project. But first of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Representative David Cicilline, who has been such an outspoken and strong voice for the case for reform, and has done so much to try and advance antitrust legislation in the US. Representative Cicilline is leaving Congress later this year, but so we thought what we'd love to have, David, is your insights on what is the landscape at the moment, the prospects for tech legislation. And also, I think we'd really like to know your thoughts on what relationship there is between this lobbying, millions of pounds of lobbying money we can see, and dozens of lobbyists, and how is it your view that they're part of the reason that this legislation has been thwarted?
Thank you very much, Carol. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be able to join you today for the launch of the Facebook Receipts, a critical news service, and really to discuss the broader need for tech policy reform. In 2019, as chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, I launched a 16-month top-to-bottom investigation into the state of competition in the digital marketplace, which included 7 hearings, the production of nearly 1.3 million internal documents and communications, submissions from 38 antitrust experts, and interviews with more than 240 market participants. Based on the report's findings, last Congress, I worked with a group of my colleagues from the House and the Senate to introduce and advance historic bipartisan tech antitrust bills to rein in big tech and to end their anti-competitive practices and market abuses online. This package included the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, which would finally take action to stop these monopolistic tech companies from preferencing their own products and services, and crack down on access to and abuse of data they gather in the market. By reining in these practices, we can give small businesses and other companies the opportunity to more effectively compete on privacy and security while introducing new innovative products. We built a strong bipartisan and bicameral coalition that passed this package of antitrust bills out of the House Judiciary Committee and advanced many of them to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Yet, as sort of related to what Carol just mentioned, despite this incredible progress, the full package wasn't given a floor vote, despite leadership's public commitments to do so. Although we had strong support across the aisle, across the Capitol, from the White House, and the public, big tech launched a $277 million lobbying campaign against these measures in an effort to stop any reforms at all, because of course they want to protect an ecosystem that has generated them profits never seen in the history of the world. When we took on this fight, we knew that we were taking on the largest economic powers in the country. We knew that we were trying to rein in gigantic monopolies that enjoy tremendous economic power and thus political power, because that's one of the great dangers of monopolies. With tremendous economic power comes tremendous political power. But what we really underestimated was the power these lobbying dollars would have against our very popular proposals. Our efforts to pass these bills demonstrate a truth unveiled by our 16-month investigation into these firms. Big tech has far too much power over our economy and our democracy. And we've seen this play out in real time with Facebook. Meta, which has been shown to prioritize growth and profit over everything else. Through the Cambridge Analytica disclosures, content moderation failures around elections, and numerous privacy violations, we've seen just how much, or frankly, how little Facebook values our privacy, democracy, and safety. Instead of having the type of competition and choice that would make Facebook a more trustworthy company, we are stuck with alternatives as surveillance and exploitation have become the business model of the internet. We really have no alternatives. And the money from this exploitative business model is being used by Facebook to lobby against any measures that would force the company to change their ways. Our suite of antitrust bills were designed to end the monopolistic practices of some of the most dominant companies in human history. But in order to pass these bills and bring about real change, we need the transparency that tools like the Facebook receipts provide. After all, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So I want to thank the citizens for launching this effort to expose Facebook's global efforts to undermine tech policy and subvert the democratic process to protect their power and their pockets. While this tool will serve to bring transparency to opaque influence campaigns, I hope it also spurs elected officials around the world to re-examine their ties with these big tech companies and recommit to acting on behalf of their constituents. The fight to rein in big tech through privacy laws, antitrust reform, and enforcement suits is far from over. And with tools like the Facebook receipts, I am more confident than ever that we will win this fight. And I will just end by saying, there is no doubt that these reforms will be passed by the United States Congress. They are widely popular with the American people. They have strong bipartisan support in both chambers, and it's just a matter of time, but we must prevail in this effort, both to preserve our economy and to preserve our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Representative Cicilline. So I'm really looking forward to journalists being able to question you a bit further at the end. If anybody wants to ask a question, please just drop it into the chat to Ben Bwiskyda and you'll have the chance. I just want to, just before we move on, I've just got one question just to follow up on that. I mean, essentially what you're saying is that the blockage of the bill by the big tech companies and their lobbying power demonstrates exactly why this bill was needed, because they have too much power. But aren't we in a sort of circular catch-22 situation there then?
No, you're absolutely right. Look, I think they proved our point when they engaged virtually every lobbyist they could find that wasn't already employed, and they spent over $200 million to stop these reforms. In fact, I had colleagues who said, I didn't really understand all the bills, but I've gotten so many lobbyists contact me that I know you must be right. They have too much power. So they've proven our point. The good news is, or the sad news for us, is that this exists in big pharma and fossil fuels. I mean, you look at the corrupting influence and money in our political system, and it explains a lot of inaction by the Congress of the United States. I think what's different about this issue is the public is really demanding it. I think it will soon be the case that you will face a political cost if you don't rein in big tech and do the right thing. I think ultimately that will demonstrate that the people of the country ultimately have the power. We just have to make certain their voices are heard and that they have the information they need to be effective advocates.
Thanks so much. And I mean, I think part of the whole problem is that we can see this is a sort of multi-million-dollar industry, and that is what this sort of project which Zaman Qureshi has created is able to demonstrate. But to fight back, it seems such an uneven, it's a real David versus Goliath battle. But I'm delighted to introduce our David, who is Zaman Qureshi, who there's a great backstory as to how I met Zaman for the first time, which was when he was 18 years old, which is all of 2 years ago, on Twitter, when I discovered this extraordinary person in Chicago who had done a FOIA request to the British Information Commissioner to ask a really arcane question on the Cambridge Analytica investigation. That turned out to be Zaman. He's now the policy expert for the Real Facebook Oversight Board. He has taken on Mark Zuckerberg on Morning Joe, and he's been identified as a young tech leader. And this is really his brainchild, and there's a phenomenal amount of research which has gone into it. So Zaman, can you take it away and show off what you've done?
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, this project has been months, over a year in the making. We have spent a long amount of time going through and preparing this research and packaging it together. So I'm very excited to finally be sharing it with all of you today, and I look forward to your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And for the press here, I'm also putting the link to the Facebook Receipts website in the chat. So I want to start off with a story. 2 years ago, Carol, myself, and the Real Facebook Oversight Board team were doing a series of meetings to brief lawmakers ahead of their testimony with Mark Zuckerberg. Representative Cicilline aside, Congress hasn't always distinguished itself when grilling lawmakers, or when grilling tech executives, and we wanted to help. We met with the Senate Commerce Committee team overseeing Meta. We shared research, we shared questions, and we pointed out clear discrepancies in Mark Zuckerberg's past testimony, places any committee should want to push for clarity. 2 weeks later, the hearing came and went. We never heard back, and our questions were never asked. Zuckerberg had wriggled out. I thought it was odd, but surely a lot of tech experts had also suggested questions. Several months later, Carol and I came across a story from Politico. The chief counsel we'd met with, John Branscombe, had a new job, head of Meta Public Policy. This isn't an accusation or of anything illegal, or really anything surprising. It's the revolving door. It's part of how Facebook and many other companies get away with it, and how they avoid accountability and wield their influence. This experience is part of why the Real Facebook Oversight Board created the Facebook Receipts, and I'm proud to launch today. The Facebook Receipts, with the link in the chat, is the first publicly available open source research tool that tracks Facebook's under oath testimony, lawsuits, global harms, influence dollars, and FOIA findings. This project is available to anyone to use as a research tool. Harms track where Facebook's fingerprints can be traced around the world. Dollars are how many members of Congress have accepted donations and made themselves on Facebook's payroll. Hearings are instances in which Facebook has misled or downright lied to government officials under oath dating back to 2006. And donations are where Facebook has spent in 2020 and 2022 to fund election cycles and candidates. We've seen hearings all over the globe. We've seen hearings in the United States, the United Kingdom. There's been a vast amount of effort put in by Congress and various parliaments to hold these companies accountable. We've seen testimony from Mark Zuckerberg and other very senior executives at the companies. And still we are waiting for legislation to hold these companies and Meta accountable. The lobbyists that work on behalf of this company have come from a variety of backgrounds, but some key trends are clear. We've seen lobbyists with both House, Senate, and White House experience. We've seen Republican lobbyists and Democrat lobbyists, and these are lobbyists who've worked in the halls of Congress, who've staffed members of Congress, who've been working on this legislation in the past, to then only go and work against it when they go to Meta. And these lobbyists have held some of the most prominent positions within these committees and within the halls of Congress. And we would like to call attention to that through the use of the Facebook Receipts. We've seen some of the biggest sort of contributors to the push against the antitrust legislation and the legislation that we've all been focusing on and advocating for, push back against by narratives that do not meet up with what we see as clearly a bipartisan effort, clearly an understanding that the American people have that this legislation is necessary and important. And unfortunately, these individuals have used their influence to combat that. Some of the biggest recipients are across the country. In both 2020 and 2022, in the United States, 49 states had contributions to their members of Congress or their senators in both Republican and Democratic states at both the House and Senate level. And that was both the case in 2020 and 2022. This really is a bipartisan effort. Facebook have made it their mission to ensure that Republicans and Democrats alike are aligned with their worldview and aligned with their mission, and that spending continues. These are some of the individuals, many of whom are colleagues to one another, who work on these issues together. And while they have the best interests of their constituents at heart, oftentimes find themselves trapped because of the donations that they receive and the lobbyists that they have to listen to who come in and lobby against them. These are the decision makers who decide whether the legislation is going to be brought before the House or Senate floor, and what steps are taken forward when a bill is brought to committee. So you can track it all on the Facebook Receipts website. And I want to end on a different note. Meta has an army of lobbyists and dollars and a massive operation to slow accountability. But the Facebook Receipts also shows that Meta is on the ropes. They're delaying the inevitable. The Facebook Receipts is one of the first tools to track hearings, testimony, legal proceedings against Meta, with dozens of legally mandated hearings and testimony under oath. Meta is the subject currently of dozens of FOIA requests across multiple agencies, some of which we filed, that's caught them lying or misleading to Congress. Meta has engaged in dozens of lawsuits around the world, many of which our panelists here today, Jason Kint, tracks online and are barely reported on. And as we saw with the Fox News Dominion lawsuit, any of these proceedings can pull back the curtain on these companies. Data is power. Our data shows how Meta is using their influence. It also shows where they might be one FOIA or one ruling away from real accountability. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Zaman. That's I know how much work has gone into that, and the intention, that's right, is to keep growing this, isn't it? You see the ways that this can be expanded further. Is that right?
Absolutely. There are a number of projects that we are continuing to undertake. And if you stay tuned on the Facebook Receipts website, follow us on Twitter, check up for updates on us. We're going to continue to update this data with more about how Meta uses its influence separate from the halls of Congress. And
some of this information hasn't come to light before, is that right? This is like
there's
things around like the unanswered questions, and there's some bits, isn't it, which is open source, but you've also taken bits of information which haven't been in the public domain before, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been clear with the folks who've asked questions about us that this majority of this data is open and available to anyone in the public. But really, this is the first time we're thinking and visualizing this data in a new way and contextualizing it in the legislation that Congressman Cicilline has put forth and many of his colleagues. But I do think that we are also pulling back the curtain in a new way. You know, the Real Facebook Oversight Board is currently undertaking a FOIA action against the SEC for disclosure of Mark Zuckerberg's 2019 transcript with the commission. I mean, that's continuous work that we will do to expose Meta's influence here, and you can stay tuned for more on that.
Thanks, Zaman. And I noticed, and maybe this is something we can come to in the questions, that one of those people on the leaderboard there in terms of the receipt of money from Facebook was actually the person who I believe stood in the way of the vital antitrust legislation, which Representative Cicilline was trying to bring us, right?
Yep.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. Shoshana, can I come to you? We are very privileged to have, I call her the queen of tech accountability, Shoshana Zuboff, who is the author, as I'm sure you all know, of The Magisterial Surveillance Capitalism, and Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School. And Shoshana, can you tell us what this means to have this money holding up this, urgent legislation that's required, and really what the solution to this is as you see it?
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Carol. Great to be here with all of you. Well, let's just be clear. Facebook was always a story about power and politics. Very little of it was a story about technology. Here's what intrigues me about Zaman's findings and the discussion that we're having today. Facebook was born with a silver spoon in its mouth. It came into the world at a time when US lawmakers had pledged to keep the internet free of public law. So why does it now feel compelled to turn around and pay a premium to lawmakers just to maintain the status quo? That's a kind of mystery and something that I'd like to unpack in the next few minutes with any luck. So going back to the beginning of the digital century, the emergence of the World Wide Web, democratic societies, beginning with the US, failed to construct a coherent political vision of how digital technologies could be deployed to advance democratic values, principles, outcomes, governance. The failure reflected a US political class captured by the conservative market privileging dogma of economists like Milton Friedman. The Washington mantra for the emerging digital century was, and I quote, "The private sector must lead. Government must get out of the way." 9/11 sealed the deal as lawmakers and intelligence agencies converged on the promise of total information awareness. All of this political abdication left a void where democracy should have been. But that void was quickly filled and tenaciously defended by the political economics of surveillance capitalism and the young companies, beginning with Google and Facebook, that led its development. This was the world of Facebook's birth, when the new information and communication spaces of the internet were ceded to private companies. In other words, surveillance capitalism is what happened when US democracy stood down. What has happened in these intervening years that now Facebook pays? And they're not just paying a little bit. As we've seen, they're paying in ways that exceed the scale and the limits that have been set by other pernicious industries, the oil industry, the tobacco industry. Now we're going beyond those kinds of investments. What's going on here? So here's my quick answer, and it may not fit with the vibe of our conversation, but here's my quick answer. Facebook is paying because we are winning. And it doesn't feel like we're winning. And when we hear David and we hear Zalman, it doesn't feel like we're winning. But I want to suggest that we are winning. Surveillance capitalism was born in the USA, the dawn of the digital century, part of a desperate search for how to monetize data after the dot-com crash. And it quickly rose to dominance on the strength of a breakthrough discovery and an extraordinarily brazen idea. The discovery was that every internet connected action means that users unknowingly leave behind a trail of highly predictive behavioral signals. These signals are only visible to the machines. That was the discovery. The breakthrough idea then would put this discovery to work. And that idea was that predictions of human behavior could be sold like tons of wheat or barrels of oil. We're talking about commodities. Human futures could be traded like any other commodity. The discovery and the idea are inseparable. Massive scale behavioral prediction depends upon the massive scale extraction of human signals, captured secretly from the once private spaces of everyday life. Google's success depended on this hidden taking without asking. Such action is normally characterized as theft, but because of the golden world into which they were born, Google's actions, Facebook's actions were not characterized as theft. But it was on the strength of this secret theft that users' private lives were declared as corporate property. From the very start, the Google founders, for example, feared the consequences if users, lawmakers, or competitors were to grasp the true nature of their operations. They concluded that success depended on confinement to the shadows. Everything they did had to be secret, hidden, obfuscated, camouflaged, indecipherable, confused by rhetoric, propaganda, and gaslighting. The entire economic edifice was built on this illegitimate bed of sand. But we were told that the conditions of surveillance capitalism were inevitable, that they were features of digital technologies, that we should quiet down, belt up, and take our place among the vast global crowds of anonymous users. But as more shadows were breached, we slowly learned more. We learned that the license to steal, this private doctrine that the companies had struck with our political leaders, that license to steal had also become a double-edged sword, sentencing Facebook to a future of high-stakes political activism, sometimes collaboration, but more often appeasement, lobbying, threat, confrontation, legal battle, warring propaganda. Facebook pays now, surpassing all prior lobbying records, because in survey after survey, and David alluded to this, huge majorities among the US and other publics decry the tech companies, reject their harms, and declare their frustration and anger with lawmakers who have left us to march naked through this digital blizzard. In a new paper called Surveillance Capitalism or Democracy, I've analyzed the new forms of violence that originate in surveillance capitalism's foundational operations of secret massive scale extraction. Organically linked, each creates the conditions for the next. Without going into any detail, I'm simply going to list these harms that have bloomed over the past 2 decades and how deeply they are connected to one another. They include the wholesale destruction of privacy, the systemic decoupling of information from considerations of truth and integrity, thus producing the kind of information corruption now identified as the leading cause of death in the United States. 3, corporate concentrations of human data that enable surveillance capitalist leaders to dominate the global market of artificial intelligence, producing incalculable opportunity costs for global society. 4, dangerous new forms of social inequality, measured by the growing gap between what I can know and what can be known about me. 5, knowledge becomes power as massive scale human data enables the remote conditioning of individual and collective behavior at scale and around the world. The companies, finally, number 6, have demonstrated to the world and to democratic governments alike that they have unaccountable power over critical information infrastructure, that this power grows dramatically, and that they are increasingly willing and able to use it against the same publics who now threaten their corporate privileges. They pay now because more of us understand that the harms they inflict on our families and societies are not inevitable. These are the conditions against which we must judge the strategies required in this crucial 3rd decade. Is regulation the answer? Is new legislation the answer? Remember that regulation is a form of bargaining and compromise. It doesn't deny a thing's right to exist. What it does do is impose constraints on that existence. Research from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties investigated Google's transmission of real-time bidding data to advertisers. And this research sheds some light on the question I'm asking. In the United States, for example, where our federal government and its infinite wisdom has yet to pass basic privacy protections, the average adult American's online activity and location data are exposed to advertisers 747 times each day. In Europe, however, where data protection laws lead the world, the average person is exposed 376 times a day. That's a lot less than what happens in America, but the question for Europeans is 376 times a day to have all of your data exposed an adequate number? Is that what we expected from regulation? Yes, regulation makes a difference, but is it enough of a difference? Can compromise ever be enough when the object of compromise is categorically catastrophic, immoral, anti-democratic, and without means of legitimate contest or choice? The question is, can we regulate our way through this founding crisis of our information civilization? Our societies have faced such questions before. Historically, one sees that the ultimate response to that which is categorically catastrophic has not in the end been the compromise of regulation. Rather, it has been abolition. For example, with changing social conceptions of childhood, child labor came to be considered a terrible abuse. Piecemeal regulation of ages and hours was no longer regarded as sufficient. Instead, a movement arose to abolish child labor as categorically immoral and anti-democratic. The most dramatic example, of course, is that of human slavery. From his youth, Abraham Lincoln has instantiated an example of this power of abolition and its distinction from regulation. Abraham Lincoln insisted from his late teens that, quote, there can be no moral right in any connection where one man makes a slave of another man. Historian John Meacham describes Lincoln's unflinching belief in the moral cause against slavery, how that distinguished him from almost every politician of his time, and how that conviction ultimately determined the course of US history. Lincoln could not accept any means of compromise with what he regarded as categorically immoral. He said, quote, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think and feel so. I propose to you today that the foundational operations of surveillance capitalism are categorically catastrophic. Its harms, its sources of violence are categorically catastrophic for people, for society, and for democracy. We find ourselves stumbling toward a future that we did not and would not choose. An accidental dystopia owned and operated by private surveillance capital, but all too frequently underwritten by official democratic acquiescence, collusion, and dependency. Facebook pays because a majority of us now reject the dystopic future. It makes for the dystopic future that it makes for the United States and for every other society, for every other democracy and struggling to be democracy. The time for compromise on these most fundamental questions has slipped through the hourglass. Facebook pays because it is afraid of us, afraid of our categorical rejection of that which is categorically wrong. It pays because abolition of its illegitimate foundations is now discussable and never had been discussable before. Indeed, abolition is likely to be the single most effective approach to reclaiming the void for a democratic and digital century. This is how we clear the way for productive, pro-social information economics that do advance the values and principles of democratic governance, where the production of data is tied to individual and community decision rights, and the uses of data are tied to the public good. That Facebook pays signals its fear. It means that we should double down on collective action. It means that we must organize in new ways. It means that we must signal our hope and our belief in one another. The time has come to return to the beginning, to finally reclaim the work abandoned there 2 decades ago. Facebook pays, telling us that now is the time to reclaim our determination to seize the democratic torch in the name of a thriving and humane information civilization. Facebook pays, and that, to me, bodes its end.
Shoshana, thank you so much. And you have the historical context, I think, is a really helpful reminder of what we're facing here. And this idea of abolition is definitely an interesting one. I'm going to flip very quickly, if I can now, to Jason Kint, who is the CEO of Digital Content Next, who Jason has really concentrated on. He's been doing his own unofficial tracking of the huge welter of lawsuits which big tech is facing. And it's kind of interesting because I think, Jason, you see it as this is an alternative route to accountability, potentially, don't you? Is that right? And this is something that Zaman has taken on from you, and this is what also is in the Facebook receipts, is this catalogue of these different cases. Can you tell me what jumps out for you from the receipts and where it might be helpful?
Sure. Thank you for having me. And brilliant. Thank you for putting this together. And the site is just a wonderful resource. You know, Carol, when I heard the number 68 hearings at the beginning of the session that are documented, that alone is a number that I don't think anybody probably knew until you all dug into it. And I'll just capture one thing from 2018 that I think probably kind of signals towards why this is so important. You know, up until 2018, Facebook really had a tight control over the narrative around the company, and they lost control that year with your big report at the beginning of the year in the spring. But later in the year, 2018, the New York Times had a report, I recall, it was called Delay, Deny, Deflect, which really captured a key strategy for them from a PR perspective in terms of that information control. And in that report, there was a bit towards the end of it around how there was one person, probably one of the key people at the company, who had negotiated her way out of answering questions regarding the biggest story of the year, and that was Sheryl Sandberg. I think if you look across those 68 hearings that you have on the site, there's probably just one hearing, and everyone should know that at that hearing, she was not asked a single question about the most important scandal of that year, and I would say of the company's history. That was lost. I don't think many people realize that. She never answered questions under oath ever about the biggest scandal in the history of the company. And so siloing information has always been a part of their game, and that includes across governments. You know, I think the fact that you have the international information on the site too is brilliant, because it wasn't until really Congressman Cicilline and some of the other parliaments started actually sharing information with each other that really bridged information across governments too. Canada wasn't able to get information from our regulator. There's new information that just came out a couple months ago about the audit that Facebook did of the thousands of other kind of Cambridge Analyticas that data was leaking to. As I understand it, Ireland's not able to use that information because it's siloed in the US. And so having everything in a public domain across borders, across parties, as Representative Cicilline was able to do with his Republican colleagues, is just critically important. And so I just applaud the work that was done, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Jason. That's really interesting about Sheryl Sandberg. I didn't know that either. So finally, I think before we come to questions, and if you've got a question, please do drop it in the chat to Ben. Mariche Sharkey is here with us, who is an incredible authority on legislation, not just in America, but also in the European Union and actually around the world. And Mariche is actually, I see you've gained some more titles, Mariche, I think, since we last did something. You're now a special advisor to the executive vice president of the European Commission and an international policy director at Stanford Cyber Policy Center. Mariche, is there anything which jumps out to you in terms of the what's in the Facebook receipts, or where you sort of feel that it brings value and really what it highlights and demonstrates for you?
Well, thank you so much, and my compliments to Zaman and the other speakers. I'll be brief so that the journalists can ask questions, because that's what they prefer to do. I think it is incredibly important to shed light both on the attempts to influence, but also at the success of influencing. And that, as a former lawmaker, I have to also remind everybody, is also a responsibility of members of Congress. We would all get lobbied. Congressman Cicilline knows this very well, but it's still up to the members to vote whichever way they do, and there must be accountability there too. But I want to end on a positive note, because it can really seem overwhelmingly challenging to create change in this conundrum that you described, Carol, where it almost seems like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of money and influence, and then nothing changes. But we only need to look to the other side of the Atlantic, to the European Union, to see that it's actually possible to adopt meaningful legislation. The Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act are being rolled out right now, and actually really begin to keep the companies to take much more responsible roles and be accountable if they don't, whether it is in terms of their size and their anti-competitive behavior, or in terms of their influence in the public debate or the curation of information for profit that so deeply impacts democracy. So I would love everybody on the call to leave feeling empowered, that because we know the way Shoshana also described so well, what the problem is with these business models. And we know that these business models facilitate this massive lobbying. By understanding what the dynamics are, perhaps we can find better nodes in the ecosystem to change, because in the interest of our democracies, in the interest of the well-being of our young people, and in the interest of fairness in the market, it is so very necessary to change the status quo. So I'll end there, and I'll be very happy to hear what questions people on the call might have.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Mauricio. And of course, you've got your own experience as a lawmaker who's sort of who knows the inside track on how this works. So there is a question in which I've been in the chat. I'm not quite sure who it's come from, but the question is, the Supreme Court is in the process of evaluating Section 230. Where does the legal process fit into this? Do you support Section 230 reform? Ben, who's that question to? Is that question to Representative Cicilline? Oh. It's for anyone, apparently. That's questions for anyone. So the Section 230, which we haven't talked about here, but Representative Cicilline, do you want to sort of have a go at that one first, and then we'll take it round to the others?
Yes, I think for the same reasons that we have seen the enormous power of these gigantic monopolies and other large corporations, the notion that the Supreme Court is a place that will provide relief, a court that's really been captured by big corporations, I think that is unlikely. But I think we need very serious Section 230 reform. And I think one of the interesting proposals, actually Congressman Buck and I introduced at the very end of last Congress, was to separate out, to basically say when someone posts something on a social media platform like Facebook, that has immunity from liability under Section 230. However, when a technology company then takes that posting and applies a complicated set of algorithms and decides how to amplify that content, they are responsible for the harms that flow from that amplification, like any other business would be harmed for making that kind of a business decision. So I think you separate out that, you would then create an incentive for these platforms to be very careful about how they were amplifying toxic, untrue, violent content, which of course they currently do at scale, because that's where they make the money. The higher the engagement, the more money they make. So they have a business model that incentivizes that behavior, and no legal system which holds them liable for any harm that flows from it.
Does anybody else want to tackle the Section 230 question? Are there volunteers, or should we take it on to the next question? I'm going to open it up. Who's nodding? Oh, they're being great.
Next.
Here we go, Mauricio. Go for it, Mauricio. Tell us.
I meant to say go to the next question.
Oh, okay, all right. So I have a question here. and I'd be interested, both Representative Cicilline and Marice, on this. What does lobbying look like? I mean, I know there's the question of there's money which is being paid, the big tech platforms are paying towards campaigns. What else do lobbyists do? Are you getting invited out to amazing meal? I mean, what's the incentives? How do they sort of get inside lawmakers' heads, I suppose, is my question.
So I can start. It is really a multifaceted approach that these companies take. So sure, it involves hiring experts, as Zaman described, people who used to work in relevant offices, who have that knowledge, who have that network, and who also understand, for example, who still needs to be pulled over the fence, and so who can be convinced of the opposite, right? Some people are very outspoken, some people are undecided, and it's usually those undecided that lobbyists are most interested in. When I was a member of European Parliament, I saw a lot of lobbying in the form of support for how to run a campaign. And this is something that didn't involve the transaction of euros or dollars, but really was Facebook offering staff and members to optimally use their platform. And what that, of course, does is really loop representatives in, make them increasingly dependent on the platform for their own political survival. And then, of course, it being much more challenging to then sort of kill off the pipeline or challenge the pipeline. That is also important for re-election. Another aspect that I would highlight that is also not the direct lobbying with the text suggested for amendments to legislative text or that kind of activities, but rather the forming of the way we understand the problems through sponsoring think tank reports, even academia. I think one of the biggest successes of Silicon Valley and Facebook being a part of that sort of cohort of big technology companies that have been responsible for this is to juxtapose democracy and innovation, regulation and innovation. You've probably all heard of the mantra, regulation stifles innovation. It is a sort of warning that people have taken at face value. And if you take that through to its ultimate effect, it would really suggest that innovation should actually trump regulation in a democracy. In other words, it really creates a kind of understanding of the role of regulation that I think is completely wrong, but that has been very dominant. And it has painted democratic regulation as the enemy of fun and good and useful and impactful, innovative solutions that social media companies and other tech companies would bring. And so that is one example of how influencing the way we think about technology is a very powerful way of shaping the debate as a result. And of course, by looping in civil society organizations, think tanks, and academia, the field where alternative visions as well as critical voices would come from gets shrunk and compromised.
It's that sort of 360 sort of information space, isn't it? What about Representative Cicilline? Did they try to get to you, or did they decide it wasn't worth the candle?
I think they decided it wasn't worth the candle. But this is a very pernicious problem in our system. In fact, the corrupting influence of money explains a lot of failures in our political system. We have the highest drug prices of any developed country in the world because of the power and the lobby of big pharma. We have never had good energy policy. We still give subsidies to big fossil fuel companies because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. And big tech is just another example. So unfortunately, because of laws in this country and the decision of the Supreme Court and Citizens United, where companies can also secretly spend unlimited amounts of money to influence elections, it sometimes doesn't come in the way of a campaign contribution, but it instead is a secret contribution to a super PAC that then spends money on behalf of a candidate. So you have the traditional financial contributions, as the last speaker was mentioning, these phony think tanks that produce reports that are funded by the industry that pretend to put forth some objective set of conclusions that people rely on. But also, the revolving door of people who have worked for these companies who then are in government and then back for the companies and back into government. So this is why it is the responsibility of an elected official to be able to sort through all of that and make the right judgments. But when you're dealing with issues as complicated as something like the digital marketplace, these tech companies have a field day because they can just, publish quickly at scale lots of misinformation about what legislation does or doesn't do. And in our effort, we were combating misinformation that they were sharing through an army of lobbyists, through online communications. And we were, a few of us trying to respond to that each day. So this is why it's so dangerous to allow companies to have this kind of monopoly.
That's so interesting, because I think we tend to think of this as sort of like the idea of like a brown paper envelope of money going to a single legislator, whereas actually what you're saying, it's this total capturing, isn't it, of the entire discourse. There's a question here from a journalist, which is actually, this is again to you, Representative Cicilline. He says, you said earlier that passing these competition bills is a matter of time, but I'm curious how this squares with the level of influence Meta exerts as shown in this report. Will the competition bills need to be modified or watered down to pass? Or if so, what kind of changes to the bills are currently under consideration?
Yeah, I don't think that, look, we were always willing to make improvements on the bills so that they would be more effective in achieving the objective that was to restore competition in the digital marketplace. But I don't think there is any interest in watering them down. The reason I think ultimately they will be passed is because the American people are demanding it. Unfortunately, every day we see more and more examples of how the power of these monopolies are crushing innovation, hurting small businesses, hurting workers. The single greatest driver for innovation is competition. When you have no competition, you don't have innovation. So if America is going to continue to compete and lead the world, we need to have robust competition in all areas of our economy, including the digital marketplace. But, most of all, people are seeing, they understand. You see poll after poll after poll. People believe Congress has the responsibility to rein in big tech. And if they don't do it, there will be political consequences. People are going to throw them out of office and elect people who are willing to do this. So I think it's inevitable because the public is going to demand it. And we're unfortunately going to continue to see harm that comes from the monopoly power and the relentless collection of information, the surveillance capitalism that Shoshana has spoken so eloquently about.
Thanks so much for that. And so one of the other things which this the new project shines light on is the lawsuits, this massive wave. I was talking to a Facebook insider quite recently ex-insider, who was talking about how the biggest department now at Meta is the legal department, has kind of metamorphosed into this massive sort of sorry, I'm losing my metaphors. I'm not sure what that is. So I'm going to go to Jason for this question, which is, it says Meta is facing any number of major lawsuits. Could any of them be the Dominion case? Do you have any view on that? There's a lot of quite interesting ones, aren't there, Jason? You are the expert on knowing what.
I think the most important case, which Congressman Cicilline hits on so importantly, is the market power case that the FTC has brought to split them up, because it gets at the root of the core of their market power, and most of the issues, whether they be issues that are mostly highlighted by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, are all downstream harms from that market power abuse where they don't have competition. So I think the FTC case is by far the most important one. And regarding the Dominion case, Facebook just settled. They're in the process of settling right now a case in federal court from Cambridge Analytica 5 years ago for a very close, I'll pick on my press colleagues on this one, but a very close dollar amount to what Dominion was, $700 million. And the discovery that literally was just coming out a couple months ago is breathtaking in that lawsuit. And I think most of it isn't even in the awareness of the public, because Facebook is so good at siloing information. They successfully rewrote the narrative on Cambridge Analytica to be just about election interference in this one company, and a lot is forgotten. So, I think that is a challenge for the press and the reporters, is that Facebook is incredibly good at proactively, offensively driving narratives rather than being on the defense, and that flooding the information system and providing exclusive access to control the press narratives as much as possible. And so, again, information repositories like this are critically important. So great work.
So, and I think I think, is this right, Ben, that we have time for one more question? And I think it would be good to go to Zaman really for this one. And that Zaman, what do you think is the sort of the most important thing that the Facebook Receipts is showing, and how are you hoping that people might be able to use it, and what for?
Yeah, so I want to illustrate something that Jason said. When Jason posted links to recent discovery from that lawsuit you mentioned, that was what got the ball rolling for us to then be able to FOIA the SEC and get Mark Zuckerberg's first copy of his transcript. It's that snowball effect of accountability. So when journalists and folks are going through this, advocacy groups are going through this website, pick on strings, pull them back, see what you can find, and let's take this further. I saw a recent interview that Congressman Cicilline gave, though, around all of the influence operations that Facebook has attempted to over the past Congress. And one of the questions was, if you were to do it all again, what would you do differently? And I think that's my question for you, Congressman. From an advocacy perspective, what advice would you have for us to improve the sort of path that we're on to get some of this legislation done? And what advice do you have to your colleagues who may have been influenced or had their opinions swayed throughout this process?
I think one of the things that we learned, because we had studied this marketplace and these businesses for 16 months really intensively. And so by the time we introduced the bills, we all deeply understood the dangers that this sort of monopoly power presented if left unchecked, and the harm that was really coming to small businesses, to our economy, to our democracy. And the thing that struck me was that we had to take that 16 months of really deep learning and try to educate people like in an hour meeting. And so I think if we could have begun earlier, but of course we didn't understand it fully till we did our own, analysis and our own investigation. But I think I was surprised at kind of how long it took us to get others up to speed who maybe weren't on the committee, didn't participate in the investigation. And if you have 10 other issues on your desk and this one's complicated, it's easy to sort of put it aside. So I think the earlier we could have begun to really educate our colleagues about the dangers and the harms that come from it, and then making sure that we're activating people who are adversely impacted by this. Those, people who have privacy interests, small businesses who have had horrific experiences with these platforms. Lots of folks who came forward had real fear about sharing their stories because of economic retaliation. One of these platforms changes an algorithm and they're put them out of business, and they understand that. And so, part of the challenge has been, how do you get people to come forward and share this information with their respective members of Congress?
Thanks so much. And I think on that note, perhaps we'll wrap it there. And we hope that's a note of hope, essentially. And at least I personally, whenever I see Zaman and his younger colleagues doing such amazing accountability work and really getting into the weeds, I do actually feel a little glimmer of hope, because I think this rising generation isn't going to stand for it. And so thank you so much, Zaman, for this, and to Ben for organising this event, and for these amazing speakers who've given up their time today. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.